All right, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. None of that was true, though. I'm just kidding. I really appreciate being allowed to speak at this conference, and I want to open by saying that we are in this conference, a lot of it talking about the mind, right, the human mind, and we all have this bizarre thing called the mind, and a lot of what we've been learning is mind content management. Right? Like here's these thoughts and feelings that are telling you you're no good. This is how you get rid of them. This is how you manage them. And it's interesting because there's no other part of us you have to interact with like that, right? It's not like there's the hand management conference, like my hand keeps doing. But the mind, it's almost like it's somebody else, right? And you can be dead set against it, and it can be dead set against you. So it's like imagine that you're at work, and you go to sit down at your desk, and every morning there's these sticky notes or post-it notes on your desk, and some of them have really encouraging messages on them, like you can go do it, this is great, everything's cool, nice hair. And then there's all these discouraging, detrimental notes that you're no good, life is terrible, something horrible is going to happen to you, etc. And we know, because we've learned these techniques, we take those bad sticky notes off and we throw them in the trash, right? We just get rid of them. We know this is how we go towards the positive ones. The question I want to ask is, who wrote those negative sticky notes? And can I go find his desk and say, can you please stop writing those? What's wrong with you, number one? Number two, even though I know I'm just supposed to get rid of yours, it's actually like a pretty significant use of my time and energy constantly taking these off my desk. Because isn't that what it is when we're dealing with our own minds? I don't know about you. But to me, every day, it's like, okay, now I'm back here. I've got to try to fix this. Got to try to get around this. Got to use my techniques. Can we find that guy and at least like ask the office manager, like, don't give him any more sticky notes. This is not company approved use. So I'm going to give you a journey that I went on to try to, and it seems like an unanswerable question, right? Or the answer isn't going to give us much insight, but I went on a journey to try to find that out. I'm going to take you on that journey along with me, and there's a couple of characters that we have to meet. And the first is this guy who's named Jerry Marzinsky. And Jerry was a licensed therapist working in state correctional facilities, so in prisons and also state mental hospitals, with usually with patients who were psychotic or schizophrenic, meaning these are people that are hearing voices in their heads. And it's to the point where it's caused their lives to fall apart in various ways, this influence, which would mean either it led them to behaviors that have got them in prison, or they've been committed to the hospital because of the way these voices were affecting their life. And so I went there. It was in Tucson. I got flown down there to go talk to him. And the reason that I was supposed to talk with him is because it was being reported that he was able to temporarily alleviate the symptoms of schizophrenia through talk therapy. So not using a drug, but just somehow he was talking with people, and it wasn't forever, but the voices would go away for a little while. So I didn't know if it was happening or not, but I was sent down there to interview him, and we set up there in his house and actually did like 8 hours of interview with him, so I got to hear a lot of his story. And he told me about when he was in graduate school for psychology, and there was a lecture the professor was giving, and it was kind of testy between the students and the professor. And at the end, the professor was like, okay, any questions? And Jerry had a question that he'd been wondering for like his whole education, but thought, well, I might as well ask it now, which is, where do thoughts come from? And so he stood up and asked that, and the professor was not impressed, and they moved on. I like that question. Thoughts have a big impact on life, and I'd like to know a little bit about where do they come from. So there's actually another wrinkle to this. I was there specifically interviewing Jerry Marzinsky because in this talk therapy that he was using, that he was saying is alleviating these symptoms, he was using Swedenborg and things supported by Swedenborg to do it. And you might be wondering, what's a Swedenborg? And I'm going to tell you, actually, I could tell you, but I'm going to let like a real Swedenborg scholar fill you in. So this is Dr. Jonathan Rose, who is the series editor of the, and he's about to say this, but I thought I would prime you, of the newest translation of Swedenborg's works. So here's a little bit, because we got to have this loaded in, or else nothing that follows will make sense. So here's Swedenborg.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Rose, series editor of the New Century edition of the works of Emanuel Swedenborg. So maybe you've heard or read something interesting about this Emanuel Swedenborg, and you want to know more. Well, perhaps the most basic thing you should know, just for purposes of light conversation, is that Swedenborg was an 18th century Swedish scientist, philosopher, and theologian. Born 1688, died 1772. The next thing you should probably know is that he was brilliant. He was what people call a universal genius, a polymath, a Renaissance man, ahead of his time. For instance, he was a submarine designer before there was such a thing, a psychologist 140 years before Freud, an aeronautical engineer 190 years before the Wright brothers. He was a mathematician, geologist, metallurgist, mineralogist, crystallographer, anatomist, botanist, chemist, physicist, cosmologist, astronomer. I'm not making this up, this is very well documented. He was an author, inventor, legislator, mining engineer, economist, editor, a poet, and a musician. He came up with the first rational design for flight and made anatomical discoveries that were well ahead of their time. He published 14,000 pages and left another 28,000 pages in manuscript. So he was one of those types. But perhaps the most important, but also controversial thing about him was that he claimed that in his mid-50s he had a spiritual awakening that opened the afterlife to him while he was still alive in this world. He was not just alive, but functioning with indefatigable energy. You could think of him as having a near-death experience that went on for 29 years while he was living his daily life, seeing friends, participating in the Swedish government, and writing more books.
So the books are what I want to talk about. Do you get a picture of what the story of Swedenborg is? Right? Guy is doing really well for himself, has a pretty good resume, and then oops, he starts to come out with these books saying something happened, and now I can see beyond the veil. As you can guess, that didn't go great for his scientific career, which is why when we say who's Swedenborg, a few people's hands go up. If I say who's Newton, everybody's hands go up, right? But Swedenborg, as you saw, at his time, he was up there with those guys. So Jerry Marzinsky was using the insights that he'd gleaned from Swedenborg to provide structure to the work he was doing with these people that are experiencing voices. So we got two characters so far. Is it making sense? Okay. And even if you said no, I don't know what I would have done. So there's another character that we have to introduce because Jerry Marzinsky was actually not the first guy to be using Swedenborg to try to investigate the world of what are called hallucinations. There's another scholar named Wilson van Dusen. And I'll read this little excerpt of a bio about him. An accomplished psychologist, Van Dusen has lectured at the University of California, Davis, served as professor of psychology at John F. Kennedy University, and published more than 150 scientific papers and written several books on his research. And there's a specific chapter of a book we're going to be looking at today from him. There's it was actually a chapter pulled out of a larger book that was then republished in a journal called Truth and Transmission, and it's called The Presence of Spirits in Madness. And this was in the 1960s. And I want to read an excerpt of what Van Dusen was doing when he wrote this. When Wilson Van Dusen wrote The Presence of Spirits in Madness, he was chief psychologist at Mendocino State Hospital in California, where he worked among the mentally ill for 17 years. In his spare time, he had discovered a way of getting an unusually accurate, detailed picture of the inner experience of hallucinations, which I will be explaining in a minute. Unfortunately, the press of other administrative responsibilities took him away from this fascinating area toward the design of national programs, especially in drug abuse treatment. He now lives the life of a busy scholar, and he's actually recently passed away. The Presence of Spirits in Madness was a particular chapter that's been more widely circulated than the book it came from, and this is a little excerpt from him describing just what it was about. By an extraordinary series of circumstances, a confirmation appears to have been found for one of Emanuel Swedenborg's more unusual doctrines, that man's life depends on his relationship to a hierarchy of spirits. Out of my professional role as a clinical psychologist in a state mental hospital and my own personal interest, I set out to describe as faithfully as possible mental patients' experience of hallucinations. So phenomenology, just describing what they had. A discovery 4 years ago helped me get to a relatively rich and consistent picture of the patient's experiences. Though I noticed similarities with Swedenborg's descriptions of the relationship of man to spirits, it was only 3 years after all the major findings on hallucinations had been made that the striking similarity between what 20th century patients describe and Swedenborg's 18th century accounts became apparent to me. I then collected as many details as possible of his description. I found that Swedenborg's system not only is an almost perfect fit with patients' experiences, but even more impressively accounts for otherwise quite puzzling aspects of hallucinations. And there may have been something that you all noticed when I got probably halfway through reading that, which is, this is going to get weird. We are going to be talking, maybe you brought someone with you here to the conference, and you're like, it's fine, it's all grounded. And we're going to be exploring some very bizarre sounding topics as we look for the root of consciousness. It's things like, it's not as bad as I'm making it sound, but things like spirits, angels, external influence on consciousness. But I think it's a journey worth taking because the stakes are so high. Anything we can find out about the mind is worth trying to learn because the mind is a problem and we're all trying to solve together. And you might wonder, why would I do this to myself? Like, why would I come here and tell you about a bunch of weird stuff? You might all think that I'm crazy, you know? But there's a good reason why I want to bring you this today, and that's because of dark matter. Okay, so you might think he's just throwing something sciencey sounding in there. I'm not an astrophysicist, and I'm not using it. I'm not going to teach you something new about dark matter, but as I understand dark matter, this is a perfect metaphor for what we're talking about here. So this is from Hubble's website. Dark matter cannot be seen because it does not shine or reflect light. Astronomers can only detect its influence by how its gravity affects light. By mapping the distorted light created by gravitational lensing, astronomers trace how dark matter is distributed in the cluster. While mapping the dark matter, astronomers found a dark matter ring near the cluster's center. You can barely tell in this photograph, but it's there. The ring's discovery, and this is the whole line I wanted to show you. The ring's discovery is among the strongest evidence that dark matter exists. We don't even know if it actually exists. It's not like we're out in spaceships running into it like, you crashed the car into the dark matter again. We know of it because the picture of the universe we have doesn't make sense without it. We look at the matter we can see, and there's got to be something else out there because the way bodies move and the way that things tug on each other doesn't account for the total behavior. So you need dark matter, dark energy to complete the picture. I know there's actually an astrophysicist here, so maybe I got that wrong. It doesn't matter. It's a metaphor. Right? You need that to really get a satisfying explanation for what we have. So what about the mind? Do we have a really satisfying explanation for the mind? I don't think so. Some people do, but there's the sort of material reductionist thing that basically says it's all rooted back in when you were on the savannah, right? When we evolved from there, and everything that we experience now is traceable back to scarcity or protection, or you're trying to pass your genes on or something like that. Which I think falls a little bit short, because if you just think about the nuances and the subtlety of the experience of being a human being, and everything like art and neuroticism and complexity of self-doubt, it just seems like there's more going on. And then you had like Freud is trying to cram it all into childhood, that just your relationship with your parents basically dictates everything about everything. But I'm like, why are we so ill-equipped to deal with our own childhood then? So potentially what I'm going to try to show you here through Jerry Marzinsky, Swedenborg, Van Dusen, and what they're finding in convergence, is this the dark matter of consciousness? Is this the thing we need to complete the picture so that even though the idea of dark matter sounds weird, but it gives us a full picture, is this the thing that can finally at least account for everything that you and I go through on a daily basis when we're trying to navigate the mind? So that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to give you now Wilson Van Dusen's methodology, because he was just talking about how he can describe what people are experiencing in what are called hallucinations, right? So you may be thinking, like, how could he possibly do that? What kind of box does he have? This is how it's done. And it's actually, when you get down to it, it's pretty simple and pretty elegant. After dealing with hundreds of such patients, I discovered about 4 years ago that it was possible to speak to their hallucinations. Whoa. Okay, but actually, it's more mundane than you think. To do so, I looked for patients who could distinguish between their own thoughts and the things they heard and saw in the world of hallucinations. The patient was told I simply wanted to get as accurate a description of their experience as possible. I held out no hope for recovery or special reward. It soon became apparent that many were embarrassed by what they saw and heard, and hence they concealed it from others. So even though it's involuntary on their part, they're just like, I can't even say what they're saying to me. And they knew that their experiences were not shared by others, and some were even concerned that their reputations would suffer if they revealed the obscene nature of their voices. It took some care to make the patients comfortable enough to reveal their experience honestly. Okay, and this is going to sound weird. A further complication was that the voices were sometimes frightened of me and themselves needed reassurance. So how could you ever know that? This line is how it goes. I struck up a relationship with both the patient and the persons he saw and heard. I would question these other persons directly and instruct the patient to give a word-for-word account of what the voices answered or what was seen. In this way, I could hold a long dialogue with a patient's hallucinations and record both my questions and their answers. My method is that of phenomenology. I borrowed that word. My only purpose was to come to as accurate a description as possible of the patient's experiences. The reader may notice that I treat the hallucinations as realities because that is what they are to the patient. I would work with a patient for as little as 1 hour or up to several months of inquiry where the hallucinated world was complex enough. And through that, like you said, phenomenology, this is like pre-science, this is just gathering information. But through that, through interviewing these hundreds of patients, he found commonalities or patterns that were consistent enough that he felt confident grouping these hallucinations into categories. Even though they were coming from different people at different times, he said that you could pretty easily, not everybody's different, but you could sort these into two basic categories, which he called the lower order hallucinations and the higher order hallucinations. And I'm going to give you his description. This is a synthesis that he just wrote up of all the things he'd heard about what he calls the lower order, and so it's just a summary based on the description. Lower order voices are as though one is dealing with drunken bums at a bar who like to tease and torment just for the fun of it. They will suggest lewd acts and then scold the patient for considering them. Like, go do that. How could you do that? You're a pervert. They find a weak point of conscience and work on it interminably. For instance, one man heard voices teasing him for over 3 years over a 10-cent debt he had already paid. They call the patient every conceivable name, suggest every lewd act, steal memories or ideas right out of consciousness, threaten death, and work on the patient's credibility in every way. For instance, they will brag that they will produce some disaster on the morrow and then claim honor for one in the daily paper. They suggest foolish acts, such as raise your right hand in the air and stay that way, and tease him if he does and threaten him if he doesn't. So you feel like you understand the character of the voices that people are describing. And it's a lose-lose. So you have that, but it's not all bad news. I want to talk about the higher order hallucinations. In direct contrast stand the rarer, higher order hallucinations. In quantity, they make up perhaps a fifth or less of the patient's experiences, so these are much rarer. The contrast may be illustrated by the experience of one man. He had heard the lower order arguing for a long while how they would murder him, so that people can be experiencing both of these simultaneously. He also had a light come to him at night like the sun. He knew it was a different order or category because the light respected his freedom, meaning it would withdraw if it frightened him. In contrast, the lower order worked against his will and would attack if it could see fear in him. This rarer higher order seldom speaks, whereas the lower order can talk endlessly. The higher order is much more likely to be symbolic, religious, supportive, genuinely instructive, and communicate directly with the inner feelings of the patient. So there you have a polarity of experience. And what we're going to do now is what interested Van Dusen after he had talked to all these patients and heard their stories was he went through Swedenborg's accounts of his experiences and was looking for similarities or is there anything popping up between these. So we understand how Van Dusen got his descriptions, right? He would talk to the patient, ask them what they're experiencing. Swedenborg is not interviewing other people about their experiences. He claims that he's reporting experiences that he's having. And you never know, but there seems to be, he had a lot to lose by reporting these experiences, and he did lose a lot by reporting them, but he felt like, I've got to talk to you about what's going on. We also have things he never published, like his journal of his own dreams and his journal to himself, in which he's never like, everyone believes me, this is great. It seems to be that he's got some kind of experience system there. So what we're going to do is, and Swedenborg himself knew this is not going to go over well. And this is actually a quote from the beginning of one of his first books in this phase, because he had published a lot of scientific books beforehand, but once he started publishing these, he says, "I realize many will claim that no one can talk to spirits and angels as long as bodily life continues, or that I am hallucinating, or that I have circulated such stories in order to play on people's credulity, and so on. But none of this worries me. I have seen, I have heard, I have felt." So he's asking for suspension of disbelief, which I think is also what Van Dusen is asking for, and I think we could give it for an hour and 25 minutes, and just explore what they're finding. And what was striking to Van Dusen is when Swedenborg was recording his personal experiences a couple hundred years before, Van Dusen finds corollaries for everything that the patients are describing in his hospital in California in the 1960s. So we're going to look at it. Van Dusen had organized, I gotta introduce you to some characteristics here, because Van Dusen talked about lower and higher order, right? But Swedenborg talked about what we would call angels and evil spirits. He used very Christian terminology for his findings, so we're going to be comparing Swedenborg's evil spirits with Van Dusen's lower order, so I want to describe what Swedenborg means by, we'll start with evil spirits. Swedenborg says everybody's a spirit, right? Everybody has a body and a spirit, and, so everybody that he met on the other side was just a person who had been in the physical world at some point and crossed over. But how are you going to go and call somebody an evil spirit? Right? I mean, which ones of us in this room are evil spirits? We're a mix, right? We have good and evil. He says that, and I have to just fly through some of these things because he wrote these 27 books explaining all of this, but I'll give you the quick version, which is here we can have, and this is a problem, so we try to make shows about this, on YouTube, and it's like, when do you stop and explain, and when do you just go through? Because you could just keep going and going. Here in the physical world, we can have pretense. I could be up here on the stage saying, like, I'm so glad to be here. I love you all, but really I'm like, I don't want to be here at all. I don't care about anyone. But you would never know because you can fake it, right? And Swedenborg says that's a characteristic of having a spirit and a body. Because your spirit, which he said, the conscious part of you is the spirit. So that you have a mind and a body. He would say the mind is spiritual. Because you have both, you can have your mind doing one thing and your body doing the other. In the spiritual world, you don't have the body anymore. So the pretense goes away, and you more and more lose inhibitions and things that keep you away from what you actually are really motivated by. So you get to make these sort of cosmic choices to really go all in. The things that don't harmonize with what you really love, you eventually kick out. And so people gravitate more towards, he uses the word evil. I think today we would use like egocentrism and materialism. It's the basic polarity is life all about me and how I feel, regardless of the expense other people have to pay, but also the rush of just being better or having power, those kinds of things. Pursuing those, that's what Swedenborg called evil. And then the other side is pursuing the things that we call altruism, mutual love, sort of a communal, pro-social lifestyle. So evil spirits were just people he's talking to that have gone all in on being selfish, right? So Van Dusen had this lower order, and he would record the things the lower order did, and then he would find, okay, where does Swedenborg describe that as well? Really quickly, and I'm not going to, these Swedenborg numbers are just to show that there are correlations. These are the ones Van Dusen found. You could add 6 or 7 to each of those. But the lower order would attempt to destroy a person. Swedenborg found that as well. They cause anxiety or pain. They speak in a person's own native tongue. They seek to destroy conscience or your sense of what is right and what is wrong. They impersonate and deceive. They lie. They claim to be anyone, including the Holy Spirit or Jesus Christ. Apparently, there's a lot of people who feel like, oh, Jesus is talking to me, but the things Jesus is saying ruin their life. They brag. They can suggest and try to enforce strange acts in the patient and then condemn him for compliance, which we said, but that's a very specific weird trait of something. So to find that Swedenborg reported the same thing is at least notable because it's not like they got together beforehand. Unless Van Dusen did and he didn't tell anyone about it. They draw attention to things sexual or simply filthy and then proceed to condemn the person for noticing them. They often refer to this one is fascinating. They often refer to the person just as an automaton or machine. A common delusion a delusional idea that many schizophrenics adopt. So many people think, I'm just a robot being controlled by these things. And that Swedenborg found that this same attitude prevailing in these evil spirits. There's also, this is a quote from Van Dusen, there are a number of peculiar traits of the lower order hallucinations on which Swedenborg throws light. If voices are merely the patient's unconscious coming forth, I would have no reason to expect them to be particularly for or against religion. Now, this was like 5, 6, 7 decades ago. We'd probably say religion or spirituality at this point, or spiritual practice. Yet the lower order can be counted on to give its most scurrilous comments to any suggestion of religion. They either totally deny any afterlife or oppose God in all forms of religious practice. They lead a person to believe what he had done, what he had not done, and aim to possess. This one is probably the weirdest one. Aim to possess or control some part of a patient's body. So what does that mean? The way Van Dusen described it, there was a woman who was being it's so weird. The woman who was being told that her voices were telling her, we are engineers and we're doing an experiment. We need your femur for this. And it's not like they could, it just was something in the way that she perceived it, but it seemed like they were after that. And Swedenborg, without, again, explaining too much here, the human body was central to his experience of the spiritual world. That, and I think I'm going to talk about this more later, but that we are sort of a miniature or a microcosm of the whole, so that everyone you meet in that world relates somehow to the human form in some way. So he would find the negative ones trying to attack the body. And I think that's, if it's accurate, is maybe why we're here at this conference talking so much about health and the spiritual value of health. Anyway, so those are the similarities between Van Dusen's lower order and Swedenborg's evil spirits. Now there's what Swedenborg called angels, which I mentioned briefly when I was on this panel before, is that angels, according to Swedenborg, are ex-people as well. They're not a separately created race of beings. And we have this in our common language. Do people say, you were like an angel to me? Or this person was like, I was about to do this, then someone stopped me. They're like an angel. Or her, she's such an angel. Right? So we have that. Swedenborg says that if you go and continue to progress into the things we're all searching for here, selflessness, love, altruism, understanding, compassion, that's heaven. And as you approach that, you become more and more what Swedenborg would call an angel. So there's similarities between Swedenborg's angels and Van Dusen's higher order, which is the angels reside in the interior mind, which does not think in words but in universals, which comprise many particulars. They gently lead to good and leaves the person in freedom. And also that the higher order has some degree of control over the lower order, like they seem to be able to affect it. The lower order cannot see the higher order, but the higher order can see the lower order. So we're off talking in the world of the spirits and angels and stuff, but in the mind, that's true. That when you're in something that we would call egocentric, do you really get what's wrong with you at that point? That's right. So when I'm self-centered, you don't even really get the value in what's other-centered. But when you're in the truth, which is that we're all human beings living in this world and we're trying to make it through and that we should be compassionate, you totally can see and identify evil. So I find that so fascinating that what they're describing is this sort of cosmic clash. You see it in the way that people behave. So the higher order's influx also is directed to our ends or inner motives. So that's just a little bit of the confluence. And Van Dusen concluded this. So what does it mean? Van Dusen concluded this out of all of it. What are the real implications of this? I'm inclined to speculate that Swedenborg's unconscious interaction of man with hierarchical kingdoms of heaven and hell and the modern theories of the unconscious are dealing with the same matter. One then wonders whether his spirits are merely pieces of the unconscious, or is the unconscious simply a reflection of this interaction with spirits? That is, which is the more subjective reality, the unconscious or the world of spirits? In the first place, I think these two are the same. If one must ask which is cart and which is horse, I think Swedenborg's explanation is the horse, the more substantive explanation. For one thing, Swedenborg accounts for newly discovered details of hallucinations better than any theory of the unconscious, and at the same time his explanation accounts for the whole order of events beyond man. That Swedenborg has described the same regions as patients' experiences I consider relatively well established. The substantive question above is not well answered, but is a matter of opinion or faith at this point. Swedenborg's conclusion is that consciousness is not a little box in the head, but that it's actually like a door. And that these people who are claiming they're experiencing something that nobody else does, it's not that their box is spitting out some kind of falsity, it's that they're perceiving a second objective reality. And Van Dusen's saying, I can't prove it, but I think that seems to me the more satisfying explanation. So with that said, I think that we're going to return to Jerry Marzinsky, because you remember him from the beginning? We've been in a lot of places since then. But Jerry Marzinsky was actually working with Wilson Van Dusen when Van Dusen died, because Jerry had started to come to these same conclusions through his interaction with patients, like, through asking them about their experiences. The hallucinations are too consistent and seem to be too strategic and too goal-oriented. They've got to be something different. My professor never told me where thoughts came from. So what is all this? And he started looking for answers, came across Van Dusen and Swedenborg. And I got to see, actually, when I visited him, I got to see their huge portfolio of emails when they were discussing how they were going to do this book and what it was going to be about. So and this is Jerry describing what it meant to find Van Dusen. He says, Van Dusen was the only colleague I dared speak to about what I'd learned and was experiencing, and the only person I knew who really understood. So he had this connection with him, but he also said that the idea that there's an objective reality outside the patient that they're experiencing is actually the key to alleviating the symptoms, and you can't do it without it. He said, as long as the patient believes that the voices are a part of their own broken mind and belong to them, massive amounts of negative emotional energy in the form of confusion, fear, and anxiety are generated. So that, to him, that was the fulcrum. That's the leverage point. Once you give them that piece of information, and he actually had this like 10-page system that he would use that I have a printout of. Not here, but I have it, I promise. That was the key. You had to have that. So at this point, you might be wondering, why am I here talking to you about psychosis, right? About schizophrenia, right? I mean, it happens, but the answer is a very good one, and it has to do with this. Okay, right. It doesn't actually have to do with the particle accelerator, but I want to make another science-based metaphor, if I may. So this is the Large Hadron Collider. You guys know of it. And this is from NASA's website about it. Why do objects have mass? To help find out, Europe's CERN has built the Large Hadron Collider, the most powerful particle accelerator yet created by humans, to figure out why objects have mass. Objects have mass everywhere, right? I mean, this has mass, right? We've got the object here. Let's just put our heads together and just figure this out right now, right? You can't. Even though you're trying to figure out something about the stuff that we deal with every day, you've got to go to extremes to figure it out. You've got to build these intense, 17-mile tunnels underground and accelerate these particles to the speed of light or close to it, smash them together, just to figure out why does the regular world work like it does. So according to Swedenborg, the people that we're calling schizophrenics or psychotics, it's not that they're a separate group of people over here. Sorry, I know I'm pretty far from this side of the room, but like that's my notes over there, man. But it's not like there's schizophrenics and they're off in some other category, and then dividing line, then there's all of us regular people. It's a spectrum, and that the forces that are influencing them are influencing us just in a more subtle way. And it's just when it crosses into a certain amount of overtness that we say, oh, they can be diagnosed. So with that said, you may be wondering, why would I be interested in all this stuff in the first place? And it really came out of an experience I had where I found that the explanation of mine wasn't good enough. And it wasn't some kind of like a visionary experience where I didn't see a spirit or an angel, but I contracted depression pretty bad, like I'd say 18, 19, 20, 21. And the experience of that, I also had obsessive compulsive. It was like I had to, if I didn't touch things a certain number of times, something bad was going to happen. And sometimes I could describe to you what that thing was, but other times it was this like sort of existential dread. The whole world was falling apart. And the multi-leveled nature of that, and the tenacity with which my mind was attacking me. And the whole experience just led me to, what's going on? What is this? So, in these concepts, we're trying to figure that out. So I have like a personal stake in trying to find the answer, as everybody does, but I just thought I would give you a little background. So I'm going to now, because Van Dusen and Jerry Marzinsky are all referencing Swedenborg, and because his accounts are so much more expansive, I am going to give you some of this world that Van Dusen thinks is, Swedenborg's world that Van Dusen thinks could be the explanation for why the people were experiencing things like they did. So I think we'll start with something easy. What is consciousness? And I'm not talking about what is consciousness like, what is the substance of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness. I'm not going to I'll solve that for you. I don't know. But I want to know what is the experience of the phenomena in our minds that we call consciousness. For example, I was walking down here. I knew I was about to give a speech. I was feeling a little bit anxious about that. And you'd get thoughts like, oh, this isn't going to go well, or this is going to go well. Then I'll get some kind of worry. Oh, am I going to wake up to go get on the plane tomorrow, or am I going to sleep through that? Where did those specific lines of code come from? So what is that? That's what I want to know. What populates our experience of consciousness as we go day to day? Consciousness as we go day to day. So that's what we're looking for. So according to Swedenborg, our consciousness, and this is how we'll begin, our consciousness exists in the midpoint of this equilibrium, of a spiritual equilibrium. And this is going to be me reading, it's a video, but it's going to be my voice again, reading from his book, Heaven and Hell, 589, where he explains the basics of what the equilibrium is. And you're going to hear him using words, using the terms good and evil, like they're forces, like pressure or buoyancy or something like that. So here's just a little bit on the equilibrium. For anything to happen, there needs to be an equilibrium of everything involved. If there is no equilibrium, there is no action and reaction, because the equilibrium occurs between two forces, one acting and the other reacting. The state of rest arising from equal agents and reagents is called an equilibrium. In the natural world, there is an equilibrium throughout. In general, in the atmospheres, with the lower layers reacting and resisting to the extent that the upper layers act and bear down. In the natural world, there are also states of equilibrium between warmth and cold, light and darkness, dry and wet. Their median blend is the balance point. There is also an equilibrium in the members of all three of the earth's kingdoms, mineral, vegetable, and animal. For nothing would occur in those kingdoms if it were not for the equilibrium. Everywhere, there is a kind of effort acting from one side and another reacting from the other. In the natural world, what acts and reacts is called force or energy, but in the spiritual world, what acts and reacts is called life and volition. Life there is a living force, and volition is a living energy, and the actual equilibrium is called a state of freedom. This spiritual balance or freedom occurs then between the good acting from the one side and the evil reacting from the other, or the evil acting on the one side and the good reacting from the other. So it's like the water column. If you think about the ocean, there is a spectrum of pressure and light and temperature as you go up and down. You go to the bottom of the ocean, it's really heavy. The water is really heavy down there. Also, it's freezing cold and there's no light. Some organisms love that, and that's where they can live. But others, like us, we would get crushed if we were down there. Each species has its own requirement, and there's a habitable zone for each one in there, right? So Swedenborg is saying that there's a habitable zone for our consciousness, and it's at this certain midpoint between what we would call good and evil, and that habitable zone is freedom. That's not just like free will. People philosophize a lot about free will, but it's not just an add-on to consciousness. Like, we have consciousness and then we have free will. Freedom is consciousness. It's the matrix in which consciousness lives. So to him, heaven and hell were not just a place you can go spiritually, but these were forces that are keeping that equilibrium going, that there is this constant outpouring of what the essence of heaven is, which is everything I was saying before: love, truth, beauty, charity. And then from hell, everything that is, as Swedenborg says at one point, grim and terrifying. Everything that is negative or antisocial or destructive. That those are actually pressing in on us all the time, and we exist in the middle. Has anyone ever felt like that is happening? So that is the way that heaven and hell are. And it's actually this spiritual world all around us. That our spirit exists in that matrix like a fish lives somewhere in the water column. And that is where we plug into life. And he says that there's just one life. It's not like here you could think there's a little lamp on the ground over there. There's one over there. There's that on the wall. Look, they all have generated electricity. They're all tapping into the same electricity, but it just looks separate. So similarly, it's not Curtis has life, then you have life, then you have. We're all tapping into the same form of life, and that is why. And the life itself is spiritual. Like this is something beyond the physical. It animates and interacts with matter at every little bit, but it's something spiritual, and that is why I think we've had such a hard time defining life in the first place. This is the current Merriam-Webster definition of life. And I'm not making fun of it because it's way better than I could do, but I want to point out the vagueness of the definition of life. First of all, the quality that distinguishes a vital functional being from a dead body. So if you're alive, it's because you're not dead. You're not like a dead body, you're alive. Again, it's because you're working with something really hard. A principle or force that is considered to underlie the distinctive quality of animate beings. Anytime you got to define something as like, it's like a principle or a force or something. And then C, this one is the one I really want to focus on. An organismic state characterized by capacity for metabolism, growth, reaction to stimuli, and reproduction. Let's just get a basket and throw everything that living things do in there. That's life. I was reading this book about it once where they're saying, yeah, we can't quite nail. It's not like, oh, there's particle Z, and when that's in something, it's alive. When it's not in it, it's dead. So, and could this be because what we're seeing is actually an interaction with this one life? Swedenborg says yes, and he says that just like you got to plug these lights into the wall in order for them to work, we have to be plugged in to the circuit of life, and I promise you some weirdness. We do this through our interaction with spirits. And it's done in a very, very specific way. Just like, electricity is really specific. I had to buy an adapter just to plug my laptop in here because the plugs are different in the United States. You can't just, okay, we're plugged into life. You've got to have the right voltage and the right prongs and everything. So there he's saying, in brief, we have at all times, to give us that equilibrium I was going on and on about, it's not just that you're sitting there and like radio waves are equilibriuming in on you on either side, that there is a specific hookup, which he said is affected by means of spirits or means of people who have passed into that world, right? And he says we have two with us in our mind and two with us in our emotions. And that these are the two primary faculties. One is a positive spirit, one is a negative spirit in each. And both of those create this equilibrium that we live in every day. So it's sort of an expansion of the circle of life. You know, you think about here, there it goes from the sun's rays into plant matter, up the food chain, into us. Well, on a spiritual level, when you die, you now become, instead of being the lamp, you're the wire in the wall. Yeah, and you can keep progressing up into being the transistor, however that works. So this connection isn't just for fun. Like you have to have it, according to Swedenborg. This is from his book, Heaven and Hell. This book is in the lobby, but you don't have to buy it. The union is so vital that we could not think that the union we're just talking about, think the least thought apart from the spirits who are with us. Our spiritual life depends on this. The angels said, oh yeah, he's talking to angels learning this. The angels said that the reason for this ignorance was that people believe they live on their own, without any connection to the ultimate reality of life, and do not know that there is this connection through the heavens. Yet if that connection were severed, we would instantly drop down dead. And there's a polarity there, not just in that they're giving us life, but they're giving us the positives and negatives of life. It says, what flows in from spirits from hell is evil and falsity. This would be, evil would be harmful feelings, falsity would be harmful thoughts. But what flows in from angels from heaven is goodness and truth. So, constructive feelings, we're back to our Post-it notes here. Found out where they came from. So the opposing influences keep us in the middle, and therefore in freedom. And these influences can actually change throughout your life as you change as a person. So is this getting weird yet? Well, if you think it is, then you're in good company, because it was also weird for Swedenborg when he started to have these experiences. This is one place where he describes it. He says, how difficult it is for a person to believe that spirits know his thoughts has been proved to me by the following experience. Before I talked to spirits, this is back when he was just a scientist, some spirit happened to address me briefly on matters I was thinking about. I was dumbfounded by this, that a spirit could know my thoughts, for I had supposed that such thoughts lay hidden and were known to God alone. After that, when I began to talk to spirits, I was indignant that I could not have any thought at all on which they did not know, and that this was going to prove irksome to me. He wrote originally in Latin, so that's the best word we could find for it. But so he's like, this is going to be really annoying, interacting with the spiritual world. But then, over several days, which seems really fast, I grew accustomed to it. At length, I came to know that spirits not only discern everything present in a person's thought and will, but also far more than the person himself discerns. That angels discern even more than that, namely his intentions and ends in view from the primary through the intermediate to the final ones, and that the Lord knows not only what the entire person is like, the Lord being the name for God, but also will be forevermore. So there's not just a connection, but it's a more intimate connection than you even have with your own self. And what he found through this interaction with the spiritual world that eventually he got used to and was still able to live out. He lived out the last 30 years of his life reporting that he was in this state, and while he was there, he was still like in the Swedish government, publishing things, able to do the labor-intensive process of put a book together, edit it yourself, take it to the printer, get the fair copy. So he was able to somehow metabolize this and keep going. But what he found when he was in that state was that to a huge extent, the things that we consider isolated psychological things, perspectives, moods, feelings, ideas, are influenced by your spiritual neighborhood. And I'm going to come at this in two ways. First of all, the idea that our thoughts and feelings are influenced by the physical world is obvious. Everybody knows that. For one thing, you can tell that people are influenced by other people by, think about somebody who has the opposite political view from you. And they happen to post something on Facebook that you find detestable. Don't you know that they only got that because they were watching media outlet X? Don't we see this kind of influence and this sort of parroting? And that right now, supposedly I'm influencing how you guys are thinking. Whether it's just to say, wow, I know what I don't think is true, or whoa, that's an interesting idea. There's an influence because where your body affects how you think. Because you're in this room, light is coming in, so that even these images are affecting your emotions a bit. The sound you're hearing is affecting it. The physical world is affecting how you think and feel. And if we are a person, meaning we have a body and a spirit, so where are our bodies? London, right? Millennium Hotel. In this room, where are our spirits? Are they in London? Are they in this room? Can they be on the second floor? Only if they can figure out how to get the elevator to work. That took me a long time. You have to put the card in before you press the button. Where's the spirit? Really, you should have seen me the first day that I was here. I would just get into an elevator and like be waiting for it to get up, and it wouldn't. I'd be pushing the 2, and then someone else got into an elevator, and I'd walk in there. It was cool. It looked cool. So the spiritual neighborhood actually is an influence. And how do neighborhoods form spiritually? Here they form based on what? Housing prices, job opportunities, history, right? The Swedenborg is saying that in the spiritual world, the force that there's analogous forces to everything that's here. So just like the role that, let's say, gravity plays here, where gravity is what keeps everything together. We're all staying here on the floor because of gravity. In the spiritual world, love plays that role, or more specifically, what you love. So neighborhoods are organized, you can call them neighborhoods, based by people who love the same kinds of things coming together. And we have a spirit right now, and Swedenborg is saying that spirit is there in some neighborhood based on what we love, because our spirit's, obeying the same rules that everybody else's spirit is. So he says that when we think, like, what is the act of thinking? If I said, go think about a bear right now, what would you do? You would right? You just sort of move your head a little bit, and that's what we think of thinking as, and then you get some ideas. He says that thinking is actually you're checking your spiritual news feed, that you are looking for input from the communities that you're associated with. And so this is him describing that. The thought of a person, of spirits, and of angels, so this is us at all the different developmental levels we can be at, spread out to numerous communities in the spiritual world, as I was shown quite plainly, but one individual's thinking spreads differently than another. So just like we all have our individualized Facebook feeds now, or there's this whole problem with we're in these isolated worlds, we have connection to different societies based on what we love and what we believe. So that I could know this for sure, I was allowed to talk with some communities to which my thinking had penetrated. From them, so he was thinking, and then he could like turn around and say, all right, so who was influencing me? What was I tapping into there? From them, I was able to learn what influence had been exerted on my thinking, what community it had come from, where the community was. This is all in the spiritual world, right? Which exists outside of time and space. So it's sort of like, it's a lot like the internet that you can access. I can have the whole internet on my computer from wherever I am. And what the community was like with such certainty that I could not be mistaken. The reach of one's thoughts and feelings into various communities brings about the capacity a person, spirit, or angel has for understanding and perceiving. So our mental gifts, personality, those kind of things, part of it is the influence of what are our spiritual connections. And we continue to forge and break these connections throughout our lives. And actually, instead of the biggest thing that he found out of all these experiences, well, I think, is that instead of being an isolated mind, we're actually part of we're a node in a huge universal human mind. He says thoughts and desires move from community to community in the spiritual world in a pattern without people realizing that they are not thinking fully autonomously. The human form, he says, is literally a microcosm of the whole reality. I was using the internet before. Pretend I have my phone in my hand. I put it in my case over there. But if this was my phone, I could say this is a microcosm of the internet. You can get everything you want on it that's from the internet, even though the actual stuff is way out on these servers. But it responds to every piece of information that's in the internet. Similarly, we are a micro version of the greater human whole. And because of that, we can receive signal from it. Here's a brain. Pretend this is a real brain scan, and that's like your neurons lighting up. We're pretty familiar with that, right? Swedenborg is saying that there are all these spiritual communities in the spiritual dimension of life, right? These are all different, these are groups of people like you and me, maybe it's your grandparents, if they've left this world, they're up there, and they're thinking and feeling. And we, just like there are thoughts and ideas spreading between communities, like trends sweep through in this world, and we are resonating with those thoughts and feelings, depending on how we're connected. So there are particular communities that we've subscribed to them, to use another social media metaphor, and whatever they're putting out, we want to listen to, metabolize, and take in. And we're all such different people because we all have different, not just different communities, but different combinations of communities that we're interacting with. So why do we each think the way we do? There is an individual, of course, but it's a more complicated, more communal story than Swedenborg ever thought before. And actually, in his day, it was much more surprising because now we're so much more interconnected because of technology. But back then, there was nothing akin to the internet, nothing else that behaved like this that he could be modeling it off of. And those groups have a profound influence on how we think and how we feel. This is another example of his experience with that. This morning I was shown plainly that there are countless particulars in every human idea and slightest feeling. In fact, if it is permitted to say something beyond human belief, sure, let's change course here and say something beyond human belief. The circumstance is similar to that of the universal world of spirits, meaning like every thought is like a micro-image of the whole. I was having a certain feeling and resulting mental image almost continuously over a period of time, and afterwards I was shown how many societies of spirits had contributed to the mental image resulting from that feeling, which some might regard as a simple, even most simple idea. The societies of spirits nearby who were contributing to it revealed themselves by actual conversation, meaning, hey, how you doing? Claiming that they were the ones who wanted this thing and were set on it, even explaining for what reason and for what purpose. So the thing that Swedenborg is contemplating, they are sort of the laboratories in which those thoughts are being hatched. Much like here, you have the presentations earlier in the conference, an idea is being disseminated there, and then we're all pondering it as we're listening to them. This revealed themselves by conversation. They did so one after the other, and yet out of so many thoughts of these images of societies arising from their desires, longings, and intentions, just one general thought or image came forth within me, because we're just like our own individual version of it. How many there were in each society, I was unable to learn, but 4 or 5, if not more, revealed themselves by open conversation, openly declaring that they had caused it, and even telling for what purpose, so what intent they had in bringing up that topic of conversation. And when we're making YouTube videos about this kind of stuff, this is usually the stuff I'd be like, I don't know if we should put it in there. That's pretty intense. But you guys, I thought, I'll give you the most intense thing I can find. Because to me, this raw data stuff that he gives is the most potent. Because that's just okay, once you can piece it together, it's not watered down at all. Next, gaining enlightenment. We talk about we're trying to grow spiritually. That's part of why we're here, right? Part of the growth spiritually is us moving to better spiritual neighborhoods. That influences it. But how could you have a better or worse spiritual neighborhood? Right? I mean, what makes that? Is it income? Aren't we trying to make it so that every neighborhood is good? Well, there, things are not separated by material. Here, it's all about material. But there, it's about intention and, antisocial versus social behaviors. So Swedenborg found these extremes that he called angels or demons, right? Which angels or evil spirits is another way. He uses a couple different terms. He said, our mind or spirit is either a miniature heaven or a miniature hell. So, I think I go back and forth, right? But he would be able to interact with people who had fully committed themselves to being one or the other. And I want to give you a little taste of both. And this is sort of the higher and lower order hallucinations, but really blown out. And I'm going to start, don't start reading that quote. I want to start with the bad news, and this is the evil spirits. You'll see him refer to evil spirits and evil demons. And again, it's just all people, but spirit has to do with intellect or thought, and demon has to do with will or heart. So these are people who are devoted to false thinking, he would call an evil spirit, and people who are devoted to corrupt desire or antisocial desire, he would call an evil demon. So I'm going to give you this. This is a really intense passage about sort of the worst experiences that he had with these antisocial people. And we know that some people behave in really heinous ways in this world. We know about narcissists or psychopaths that will do really, or even, not so long ago I had to cancel my debit card because somebody found the number and was trying to spend $1,000 in Long Island, right? People will use the means they have to try to get something out of you, right? And Swedenborg says on the psychological or spiritual level, the tools there are just much more intimate so they can get access to. So here it is, he's describing the synthesis of the worst things that evil spirits would try to do to him. Seatbelts. Evil spirits never fight against anything but what we love. The more passionately we love something, the more bitterly they fight it. Evil demons combat anything good that touches our hearts, and evil spirits combat anything true that touches our hearts. As soon as they become aware of something we love, no matter how small, or smell out anything dear and pleasing to us, they immediately attack and try to destroy it. In the process, they are trying to destroy the whole person, because our life consists in what we love. Nothing could possibly give them more pleasure than to destroy us. And you get these interviews with people like the worst of the worst criminals, and don't you feel terrible about what you did? And to them, no, that's what I like to do. The malicious, deceitful ones worm their way into our central loves, stoking them and so awakening us to them. So this is, because it's spiritual, there's this direct asset. Swedenborg was able to observe, they're trying to, my love for something, I can actually, because he had this sort of state of heightened perception, I can see how they're trying to impact the way that I feel about this thing to a very high level of detail. So that's where this is coming from. stoking them and so awakening us to them. Once they have done so, they immediately set out to destroy what we love, and consequently to kill us by 1,000 bewildering means. They do not fight by arguing against what is good and true. So it's not really a combat in the mind, and this is the emotional side of it. Instead, they pervert what is good and true, setting it aflame with a fire of appetite and delusion, so that for all we know, we share their appetites and delusions. They also seize on some unrelated pleasure in us and feed the flames with it. So, meaning, you don't necessarily care about this thing, but they can kind of siphon out something else you do care about it and force you to care about something you don't care about. In this way, they very deviously infect and harass us. So skillfully do they work as they spread their contagion that if the Lord did not help us, we would inevitably believe them. And I know we've talked a lot about the power of not believing negative messages. They level the same attack on the devotion to truth that forms our conscience. So this will be your higher principles, your belief system. As soon as they detect a trace of conscience, no matter how imperfect, conscience meaning your sense of what is good and what is not good, what is right and wrong, they take our misconceptions and weaknesses and shape them into a fog of emotion, which they use to block and distort the light of truth, or else they torture us with anxiety. Another device they use is to train our thoughts on a single issue with no let-up. They fill it up with crazy notions and at the same time secretly tie our cravings into the insanity. They have countless other underhanded methods as well, which could never be described intelligibly. Little of this is the kicker, little of this reaches our conscious awareness, and only in its most general outlines. Because I've never had anything like that happen to me. I've never had an evil demon come and try to... A lot of people report they have, but for me personally, I haven't. However, I've had a fog of emotion. I've been tortured by anxiety. I've felt like, why do I care about this thing that I don't really want to care about? Why does it feel like I can't care about? So when I look at just and if he's saying, you only feel this in the outermost ways, in the most obscure ways, okay, maybe I've participated in that in my own little way. All right, so that's all. Sorry, I'll go right back to that. This is all the bad stuff. I always start with the bad stuff, but there is just as detailed information about how the good side of it works. And so a lot of people report experiences with angels. This is what Swedenborg found were the characteristics of angels. The Lord provides that spirits influence our thoughts and wishes. Spirits being people who are still kind of in the middle. So we're hooked up with people who are similar to us that haven't ascended or descended to these sort of polarity. Spirits influence our thoughts and wishes, but that angels influence our ultimate goals. And through our goals, the consequences that result. So it's not like they're trying to, come on, think like this, but what are you trying to do with your life? Here's what I'm trying to influence. Always pushing it up towards altruism. Angels also flow through good spirits, through that conduit that I was showing you before, into the good deeds we do and the religious truth we believe. Again, you would call that spiritual truth as well. Using these to lead us away from evil and falsity as much as possible. Their influence is silent and imperceptible to us, but even though it is secret, it works. And I don't know if you've ever felt like, so if there is good and bad, where's the good right now? You always hear the bad. Swedenborg is saying it's there, and it's more effective. Also, I like this little thought that he had. When angels exert an influence, they attach feelings to it. And feelings themselves contain too many elements to count. But we accept only a few of these countless elements, only the ones that relate to what we already have in our memory. The result of the angelic influence the rest of the angelic influence surrounds these core items and holds them in its embrace, so to speak. So they're telling us something, but it's so above our pay grade that we just get this one thing out of it, but the rest is there, sort of like a cocoon around it in us. I think that's all I'm going to say about that. The last thing I want to talk about is the structure of thought. Because one of the most fascinating things to me is that Swedenborg, like we can know that there's like physical structure to thought. You can look at a brain scan and we're just in like the rudimentary phases of it now, but eventually maybe you can identify, like if someone's thinking about cheese, this is what lights up in your brain, like to a level of detail where you could have a specific shape to each one. But Swedenborg is not talking about the brain's response to thought, but the structure of thought in psychological terms. Like a desire to help. What is in a desire to help? Is there a knowledge of what's good and true? Is there a larger understanding of what helping is? Are there memories from your child? What is the substance of that? He says, just like a muscle is made up of a ton of little cells, so a thought is made up of all these minute elements. And we're going to begin by him describing that, and in a very strange context. Because he's talking here to a group of students. This is out of his Journal of Spiritual Experiences, I believe. And I'm not totally sure, but it seems like he's saying the students are spirits. Meaning the students are in the spiritual world, but yet they can see and he's trying to educate them based on this metaphor of a bug. Okay? That's not so bad. So this is me just reading directly from Swedenborg as he describes the complexity of thought.
All of a sudden, the students saw a bug scurry across my paper, and they asked in amazement what such a speedy little creature could be. I said, we call it a beetle, and I'll tell you something remarkable about it. In that tiny creature, there are just as many parts and organs as there are in a camel. There are brains, for example, hearts, pulmonary ducts, organs of sense, of motion, of reproduction, stomachs, intestines, and even more. Each of these is made up of fibers, nerves, blood vessels, muscles, tendons, and membranes, and these in turn are made up of still purer components that are too small for the eye to see. They remarked that even so, this little creature looked exactly like a single thing, and I said, still, there are countless things in it. I'm telling you this so that you will realize that the same thing applies to everything that looks single, simple, and minute to you, including your actions, your feelings, and your thoughts. I can assure you that every spark of your thought and every drop of your feelings can be divided to infinity, and that as your ideas divide, you become wise. Bear in mind, then, that as anything is divided, it becomes more and more complex, not more and more simple. Because as we divide it again and again, we come closer and closer to the infinite, which contains everything infinitely.
So I imagine they were like, what? What did you just say? But the idea that an idea can be divided into supporting concepts. And Swedenborg describes this a little farther, saying that every affection or idea, everything mental or emotional in us is actually a hologram of the whole of us. We are contained in it because, like I was saying before, that we're sort of a microcosm of the macrocosm, that the whole world of spirits is functioning just like our body is functioning. Well, it goes down a level too, that every little thought and feeling has all the component parts that we do. So this is where he's describing it in Secrets of Heaven 3078. Any desire or emotion contains within itself such a boundless number of elements that it cannot possibly be grasped in any way, still less described, even though it appears to be a single, uncomplicated entity. Every emotion holds within itself the whole life we have acquired from infancy up to whatever stage we have reached when we develop the emotion. In fact, it contains even more than that, since it includes what we have inherited by birth from our father and mother, our grandparents and great-grandparents. The emotion is the whole person, just as he or she is. In the other world, meaning in the spiritual world, our dominant desire is sometimes laid out in the open and presents a picture of us. It shows how much self-love and how much materialism we harbor. Him using self-love in its negative sense, or egocentric selfishness. How much a love for good principles and what kind of goal and purpose we have. It reveals how much we love what is good and true and what that goodness and truth are like, and also how they are organized. The closer ties, the looser ties, the wide gaps between them. So it indicates how far out of tune with the design of heaven we are, or how far in tune. All these things become clear from a disclosure of our desire or emotion, as I said, because the emotion is the whole person. It seems incredible to people on earth that this could be so, but it is still true. So not only can thoughts and feelings be understood, but you can understand the parts of them. And from just one, if you know how to look right, you can know everything about yourself, even about your heritage, and about where you need to go next. And it's sort of like comforting, I find, because there was a time when my thoughts and feelings were so opaque and they're so confusing, and they still are on a day-to-day. Why Why am I being told these stories about life? Why do I react to things the way I do? What am I? Is it always just kind of be like, yeah, maybe it is because when I was X years old, I didn't get something. Or maybe I'm trying to try that. Like, I've been in therapy. You get in therapy, you talk about something, you cry about it. And it's great, but there's still a lot of mystery. And so is there some time when you can look it over and you can see, and like, oh, just like with a car, like the reason you're not starting is that you see your spark plug there. And so with me or with you, is it just like, well, there's this one little thing, and we can fix that, and then things are going to start to make sense. So what's the end game? Like, what's the point of all this stuff? I want to show you the place that Swedenborg got to because of his ability to go into the world that was behind his thoughts and feelings. For many years now, all my thoughts and feelings in their very smallest points have flowed in by means of spirits and angels, and I have been allowed to perceive it so plainly that nothing is plainer. I have sensed, seen, and heard who they are, what they are like, and where they are. When anything untoward has dropped into my thought or will, I have talked with them and lodged a vehement complaint. That's the sticky note guy. He got to go and say, why did you put this in my mind? Not only that, but I understand who you are and what your motives are. I have also noticed that angels reign in those spirits' power to an extent, such an influence on me, and have seen how they do it. Often the spirits are driven away, and when this happens, I have noted their place is taken by new spirits who also exert an influence, so moving that spiritual neighborhood. I have been able to tell where these spirits were from, or in other words, which communities they were proxies for. That's a whole other thing. And many times I've been given the opportunity to talk with the communities themselves. I know that hardly anyone will believe such a thing, but it is an eternal truth. I just think about when somebody insults you. Like, let's say, right now, somebody was like, boring. Like one of you guys said that about my speech. I would like, wait, why did they say that? And it's just because it really was boring? But if I could know, oh, it's because I'm wearing a black shirt, and they historically have never liked black shirt. The more we understand about where the stuff is coming from, it starts to ease the pain of it a little bit. Swedenborg, when he would get these things in his mind that we all get, the monkey mind that we're all trying to get rid of, he could go find out where it came from, what the motivation was, and also what the good was that was coming through it. And to him, this became total mental freedom. He was no longer worried by anything that came in. He was no longer distressed. It was peace. It's what he calls the stream of providence. So there's a potential there. And I want to end by getting a little biblical on you. I mean, it's Sunday. It's not very biblical. But I want to talk about, there's a story of Jesus Christ in the lake with the storm. You guys know that story? Well, so Jesus is out in a boat with the disciples, and they're saying to him, I'm paraphrasing, of course, hey, there's a storm, and we're all going to die from this storm. We don't want to die. You're Jesus. Can't you do something about it? And so he wakes up, and he says to the wind and the waves, like, stop. And they stop. And then afterwards, the whole point is this line afterwards, when they're like, who's that he can get the wind and the waves to obey him? So I want to just apply this to the metaphor of the wind and the waves in the mind. If your mind has ever felt like a stormy sea. Whenever anything that I come across can get the wind and the waves to lie down, I'm like, what is that? And I've found, believe it or not, in my life, even though, right, I haven't seen spirits or angels, when I start to apply Swedenborg's model of consciousness to my own mind, that calms the sea like nothing else that I've found. So I felt like I had an obligation to try to give that to you, and hopefully I've done some of that today. Thanks so much.